The Burning City. Inti, Imperial Tower, night. Fire licks at the walls of the opulent palace as Julian watches Rome burn from his tower. His hands tremble, not from fear, but from an almost sexual excitement that courses through him like electricity. The 27-year-old emperor smiles, lips parted, his glazed eyes reflecting the flames consuming his own city. "How beautiful destruction is when I control it," he murmurs to himself, stroking the lyre he holds against his chest as if it were a lover. This isn't the image of a madman. It's something infinitely more terrifying, the pure manifestation of pathological narcissism at the height of its destructive power. Julian, born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD, was the son of Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus and Agrippina the Younger. From his earliest days, the future emperor was immersed in an atmosphere of absolute privilege and constant adulation. His mother, Agrippina, a woman of ferocious ambition and calculated manipulations, molded the boy not just to rule, but to believe he was divinely ordained. Young Lucius, who would later adopt the name Julian, never heard the word no spoken with any seriousness. Every whim was satisfied, every tantrum interpreted as a manifestation of his natural superiority. Palace slaves whispered amongst themselves about the strange boy who tortured small animals with the same serene expression he used to recite poetry. Agrippina, far from being alarmed, interpreted this cruelty as a sign of imperial strength. "My son possesses the hardness necessary to rule," she declared to senators visiting her villa, while the 8-year-old systematically tore the wings off a fly, watching it struggle on the floor with scientific curiosity. It was impossible to distinguish where the child ended and the monster began, perhaps because there was never any boundary. Julian's education was entrusted to Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, who would try in vain to instill in the young prince concepts of virtue and moderation. But how do you teach humility to someone who had never experienced limits? How do you cultivate empathy in a mind that viewed other human beings as extensions of his own will? Seneca would later write, in letters preserved by time, about the disturbing nature of his pupil. "Young Julian possesses a sharp intellect and a thirst for knowledge, but there is something in his eyes that deeply unsettles me. When I explain the virtue of clemency, he smiles, not with understanding, but as if I were describing a particularly ingenious military strategy." Julian's narcissism wasn't mere vanity. It was a complex and destructive psychological structure that modern scholars would recognize as narcissistic personality disorder in its most extreme form. His need for admiration was so intense, it was almost physical. Witnesses report that the young prince would enter states of genuine agitation when he didn't receive the expected attention, trembling like an addict in withdrawal. His lack of empathy was so complete that he genuinely didn't understand why people suffered when he hurt them. To Julian, others weren't fully real. They were supporting actors in a drama starring exclusively himself. When Claudius was poisoned in 54 AD, most likely on Agrippina's orders, Julian ascended the throne at only 17. Rome never imagined it was handing absolute power to a mind fundamentally disconnected from human reality. The first years of his reign were marked by a facade of competence carefully orchestrated by his advisors. Seneca and Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, acted as filters between the young emperor's destructive impulses and the practical demands of government. Julian tolerated them because he still needed them, but he already secretly planned how to rid himself of any influence that limited his will. Julian's transformation from spoiled teenager to absolute tyrant wasn't abrupt. It was a gradual and terrifyingly systematic process. Each small transgression that went unpunished fueled his conviction that the rules didn't apply to him. When he ordered the execution of a slave for spilling wine on his robe and no one dared protest, Julian felt a surge of power that was almost addictive. When he forced a senator to watch as he tortured her own son, and she remained silent out of fear, he understood there were no limits to what he could do. The imperial palace became a laboratory of cruelty where Julian experimented with the boundaries of psychological domination. He developed elaborate games of public humiliation, forcing respected senators to behave like animals for his amusement. He made a point of systematically breaking people's dignity, not out of anger, but out of sheer pleasure. Witnesses describe how his eyes gleamed when he saw tears of despair on the faces of his victims. The emperor didn't seem human in those moments, a survivor recounted years later. There was something reptilian in his expression, as if he were savoring an invisible feast. Julian's relationship with his mother, Agrippina, perfectly illustrates the pathological nature of his narcissism. She had been instrumental in his rise to power, but she also represented the only person who still dared to contradict him. For a narcissistic mind, this was intolerable. Agrippina didn't understand that she had created a monster who would eventually destroy her. When she attempted to maintain some influence over imperial decisions, Julian interpreted this as an unforgivable personal betrayal. From 55 AD onwards, he began systematically planning the elimination of his own mother. The process of Agrippina's destruction was a masterpiece of calculated sadism. Julian didn't simply want to kill her, he wanted to break her soul first. He began by gradually removing all her privileges, dismissing her servants, confiscating her properties, isolating her socially. Each humiliation was accompanied by cold smiles and public declarations of filial love. Agrippina, even with her sharp political intelligence, couldn't fully grasp what was happening. How could a mother understand that her own son saw her not as a person, but an obstacle to be eliminated? Nero's descent into madness. Agrippina's attempted assassinations reveal the truly disturbing nature of Julian's mind. He didn't choose simple methods, he developed elaborate theatrical plans that reflected his need for total control. First, he tried poisoning her food, but Agrippina the Younger had developed an immunity to many poisons. Then, he designed a ceiling to collapse on her during a banquet, but technical difficulties foiled the plan. Finally, he created a boat with a trapdoor that would spring open during a sea voyage. When Agrippina survived by swimming to shore, Julian abandoned subtlety and sent soldiers to kill her outright. The murder of Agrippina in 59 AD marked a turning point in Julian's psyche. He had killed the only person who still saw him as human, and discovered that this caused him not remorse, but a sense of absolute freedom. Accounts from the time describe how he examined his mother's dead body with clinical curiosity, commenting on her beauty even in death. "Finally," he is said to have murmured, "there is no one left to tell me I am mortal." From that moment, Julian was no longer a cruel emperor. He became something utterly unlike humanity. If you've been intrigued by these in-depth analyses of historical figures and psychology, consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this, exploring the most complex and disturbing minds in human history. The elimination of Agrippina unleashed Julian's darkest impulses, but also removed the last anchor connecting him to reality. His pathological narcissism, previously constrained by practical political needs, exploded into increasingly bizarre and destructive manifestations. He began to see himself not merely as emperor, but as a supreme artist, an unparalleled athlete, and a god incarnate. His need for admiration became so intense that he forced the Senate to watch his musical performances, threatening death to anyone who showed boredom or disapproval. Julian's public performances revealed the depth of his disconnect from reality. He genuinely believed himself to possess exceptional artistic talent, when in fact his voice was described by contemporaries as weak and shaky. But no Roman dared express honest opinion. The result was an echo chamber that constantly confirmed his delusions of grandeur. The more people pretended to admire his art, the more convinced he became of his own genius. It was a vicious cycle where forced flattery fueled a narcissism increasingly detached from reality. Julian's relationship with Poppaea Sabina, his second wife, illustrates another terrifying aspect of pathological narcissism, the inability for genuine love. Poppaea was a woman of exceptional beauty and sharp political intelligence, but to Julian, she was less a person than a trophy. He fell in love not with her, but with his own image reflected in her eyes. When Poppaea tried to exert her own influence or showed independent personality, Julian interpreted this as betrayal. His passion for her was actually a form of projected self-adoration. The murder of Poppaea in 65 AD, when Julian kicked her in the abdomen while she was pregnant, marked the moment his narcissism transformed into full-blown psychopathy. Witnesses report that he showed initial remorse, but soon began rewriting the narrative in his mind. Within days, he was declaring that Poppaea had died of natural causes, and eventually came to believe his own lie. His ability to distort reality to protect his self-image was so developed that he genuinely couldn't distinguish between truth and fantasy. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD represents the destructive apex of Julian's pathological narcissism. While modern historians debate whether he actually ordered the fire, contemporary accounts describe behavior revealing a mind utterly disconnected from human empathy. As Rome burned and thousands lost their homes, Julian saw an artistic opportunity. He supposedly sang about the destruction of Troy, comparing himself to Homer and declaring he was creating a live masterpiece. Julian's response to the disaster was characteristically narcissistic. He didn't focus on helping the victims or rebuilding the city. He focused on how the fire could benefit his own projects. He exploited the destruction to build the Domus Aurea, his golden house, a palatial complex that covered nearly a third of the city. The palace wasn't just a residence, it was a physical monument to his own ego, complete with a 115-foot statue of himself. Every room was designed to remind visitors of imperial magnificence, as if the building itself were an extension of his grandiose personality. The Domus Aurea revealed the deeply disturbing nature of Julian's mind. He had created a world where he was literally the center of the universe. Rotating rooms followed the movement of the sun, artificial gardens replaced natural landscapes, and elaborate mirror systems multiplied his image infinitely. Living there was like inhabiting the psyche of a pathological narcissist. Everything was arranged to reflect and amplify a single personality. Visitors described the oppressive feeling that they weren't welcome guests, but rather intruders in a sanctuary dedicated to the cult of a single person. Julian's paranoia intensified dramatically after the Pisonian conspiracy in 65 AD.
His reaction to the assassination attempt revealed another terrible aspect of pathological narcissism, the inability to distinguish between real and imagined threats. To a narcissistic mind, any challenge to its supremacy is interpreted as an existential attack. Julian began seeing conspiracies everywhere, ordering executions based on paranoid suspicions. Senators, generals, even close friends were eliminated for imagined crimes. The death of Seneca, his former tutor, symbolized Julian's complete divorce from any sense of morality or gratitude. Seneca had for years attempted to moderate the emperor's destructive impulses, but was forced into suicide on false charges of treason. Julian watched Seneca's death with the same serene expression he used to watch gladiators in the Colosseum. To him, the elimination of any voice questioning his greatness was not only necessary but pleasurable. Each execution confirmed his absolute supremacy. Julian's mental deterioration accelerated as his isolation increased. Surrounded only by flatterers and those dependent on his goodwill for survival, he completely lost touch with reality. He began to literally believe in his own divinity, demanding that people worship him as a god. His speeches became increasingly incoherent, mixing grandiose artistic plans with death threats against anyone who didn't show sufficient enthusiasm. Julian's behavior during the final years of his reign revealed a mind in complete collapse. He would spend entire days rehearsing for performances that never happened, talking to himself as if he were an audience. Servants report that he frequently argued with his reflections in mirrors, seemingly unable to distinguish between his image and other people. His need for admiration had become so intense that he created imaginary situations where he was acclaimed by non-existent crowds. Galba's revolt in 68 AD confronted Julian with a reality his narcissistic mind couldn't process. He was neither loved, nor feared, nor respected. The discovery that legion after legion was rebelling against him triggered a complete psychological collapse. For the first time in his life, Julian faced the possibility that his grandiose self-image was completely false. The response was a psychotic break that lasted for days.
Witnesses describe Julian during his final days as a broken creature, alternating between manic rage and catatonic depression. He wandered the halls of the Domus Aurea talking about vengeance against Rome, then hid in corners weeping like an abandoned child. His inability to accept rejection was so profound that he literally couldn't understand why people didn't love him. To a narcissistic mind, being rejected is equivalent to ceasing to exist. Julian's flight from Rome was a journey through the wreckage of his own psyche. He had spent his entire life believing he was the center of the universe, and now discovered that the universe continued to function without him. His response was to deny reality. He continued to expect people to recognize their mistake and come to beg his forgiveness. Even as soldiers approached to arrest him, Julian seemed incapable of understanding that his authority had vanished. Julian's suicide on June 9, 68 AD, was less an act of courage than the final collapse of a mind that never learned to exist without constant adoration. His last words were supposedly, "What an artist dies with me," a statement that perfectly encapsulates the nature of his pathological narcissism. Even in death, he couldn't see beyond himself. There was no reflection on the people he had tortured, the cities he had destroyed, or the lives he had ruined. There was only lament for the loss of his own imaginary magnificence. Julian's death marks the end of one of the most extreme examples of pathological narcissism in human history. But his legacy goes beyond individual cruelty. He demonstrates how a mind disconnected from empathy can use power to create suffering on a massive scale. Julian wasn't simply a cruel tyrant. He was a human being whose basic psychological structure had been corrupted since childhood by a lack of boundaries and an excess of flattery. Modern analysis of Julian's behavior reveals patterns that psychologists recognize in narcissistic personality disorder. A constant need for admiration, lack of empathy, a grandiose sense of self-importance, interpersonal exploitation, arrogance, and beliefs of special uniqueness. But Julian's case shows how these traits, when combined with absolute power, can create a monster that transcends individual pathology and becomes a force of historical destruction. The tragedy of Julian lies not only in the suffering he caused, but in the demonstration of how a human mind can completely disconnect from humanity. He represents a terrible experiment on what happens when pathological narcissism is nurtured from childhood and then armed with unlimited power. His life serves as a dark warning about the dangers of creating social structures that allowed destructive personalities to thrive without limits. Rome survived Julian, but the scars of his reign remained for generations. More importantly, his story remains relevant because pathological narcissism has not disappeared from the human experience. The same psychological structures that created the monster that was Julian continue to exist, waiting for circumstances that allow their manifestation. The difference between the average narcissist and the destructive tyrant is often just a matter of opportunity and power. The study of Julian's mind forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. He wasn't born a monster. He was created by a society that confused adoration with love, power with virtue, and submission with loyalty. His transformation from privileged child to pathological tyrant shows how narcissism can be cultivated and amplified until it becomes a destructive force that consumes not only the individual but the entire society around him. The most terrifying lesson of Julian's story is that he wasn't a unique aberration. He was a logical product of specific circumstances that can be replicated. Whenever a society fails to establish healthy limits on power, whenever it confuses flattery with respect, whenever it allows individuals to grow without experiencing real consequences for their actions, it creates the perfect environment for the flourishing of pathological narcissism. Rome believed it had entrusted power to a god. It discovered too late it had nurtured a demon. Julian's mind serves as a perpetual reminder that the most dangerous monsters are not those born of evil, but those created by unconditional adoration and limitless power. His story echoes through the centuries as a warning about the dangers of mistaking greatness for goodness, charisma for competence, and authority for wisdom. The true tragedy of Julian wasn't just what he became, but what he could have been. Born into one of the most privileged families of the ancient world, educated by the finest tutors, possessing unlimited resources to do good, he had everything necessary to become one of history's great leaders. Instead, he became a living demonstration of how pathological narcissism can transform privilege into a curse, power into destruction, and human potential into a historical nightmare. In studying Julian's mind, we are not merely examining a Roman emperor who died 2,000 years ago. We are looking into a dark mirror reflecting the most dangerous aspects of human nature. His story serves as an eternal warning about what happens when we allow pathological narcissism to combine with absolute power. It's a lesson each generation must relearn, because the forces that created Julian never truly disappeared. They merely await the next opportunity to emerge from the shadows of the human condition.